In 1960, the FDA pulled the ingredient that gave root beer its real flavor and declared it a cancer risk. That chemical had been in American kitchens for over a century. It was not the first food banned decades too late. Here are 30 illegal foods you cannot sell in America anymore. Sassafras oil was the soul of American root beer for nearly a century. From the late 1800s through the 1950s, every bottle owed its warm, earthy bite to oil extracted from sassafras bark. Pharmacies sold sassafras tea as a fever cure. Grocers stocked sassafras candy. The flavor was woven into soda fountain culture from coast to coast. In 1960, the FDA banned saffrole, the key compound in sassafras oil, after studies linked it to liver cancer in rats. Brewers scrambled to reformulate with artificial substitutes that never matched the original. Saffrole also turned out to be a precursor for manufacturing MDMA, which deepened the government's resolve to keep it controlled. The root beer you drink today is a synthetic imitation of what your grandparents actually tasted. Before Kinder Joy hit American shelves in 2017, the original Kinder Surprise egg was straight-up contraband. Ferrero's hollow chocolate egg with a plastic toy sealed inside violated a 1938 law banning any candy containing a non-nutritive embedded object. Customs agents treated these eggs like smuggled goods. Between 2011 and 2013, border officials seized over 60,000 Kinder eggs, often confiscating them from families returning from European vacations. Individual fines could reach $2,500 per egg. The whole situation was absurd. A hollow chocolate treat beloved by millions of kids across 30 countries was classified under the same statute meant to keep broken glass out of food. Ferrero eventually spent years engineering a compliant version that split the toy and chocolate into separate sealed compartments, finally reaching American stores nearly 80 years after the law was written. Red dye number 2 colored your candy, brightened your soda, and made your breakfast cereal look appetizing. Through the 1960s and into the mid-70s, this synthetic dye called amaranth showed up in everything from Kool-Aid to Hostess snack cakes to pet food. Products worth over $10 million a year contained it. A Soviet study linked amaranth to cancer in rats. American researchers could not conclusively replicate the results, but the FDA was boxed in by its own rules. The Delaney Clause, a 1958 amendment to the Food Additives Act, required any additive shown to cause cancer in animals to be pulled. No cost-benefit analysis, no exceptions. In January 1976, the FDA officially banned red dye number 2. Candy manufacturers panicked ahead of Valentine's Day, afraid their red sweets would rot on shelves. Mars pulled red M&Ms entirely, not because they contained the dye, but because the company worried about consumer confusion. Red M&Ms did not return for over a decade. By 1969, Cyclamate controlled 30% of the artificial sweetener market, with annual sales exceeding $1 billion. It was in Diet Pepsi, Tab, Fresca, and in the little packets of Sucralil sitting on diner counters across America. Unlike saccharin, Cyclamate had no metallic aftertaste and was stable enough for cooking. Then, a study found that rats fed a cyclamate saccharin mixture developed bladder tumors. In October 1969, Health Secretary Robert Finch bypassed the FDA commissioner and revoked Cyclamate's safety status. By February 1970, it vanished from every American food and beverage. Abbott Laboratories fought back. Their own researchers could not reproduce the cancer findings. In 1984, the FDA's own Cancer Assessment Committee concluded cyclamate was not carcinogenic. None of it mattered. Cyclamate remains banned in the United States, while over 130 countries, including Canada and every EU member, sell it openly. If cyclamate proved how fast regulators could move on shaky evidence, Alar showed how slowly they acted when the science was strong. Alar was a growth chemical sprayed on apples to give red delicious varieties their uniform color. Uniroyal Chemical registered it in 1963. By the early 80s, researchers flagged Alar and its breakdown product UDMH as probable carcinogens. The EPA proposed a ban in 1985, then retreated under industry pressure. It proposed again in early 1989 and retreated again. A February 1989 broadcast of 60 Minutes, seen by 40 million viewers, finally shattered the deadlock. Schools yanked apples from cafeterias. Meryl Streep testified before Congress. Growers sued CBS and lost. Uniroyal pulled alar before the EPA's ban took effect. Diethylstilbestrol, known as DES, was a synthetic estrogen that cattle ranchers started adding to feed in the early 1950s. The drug made steers bulk up faster on less grain, and by the mid-60s it was standard across American beef operations. The problem was that DES was already a recognized human carcinogen. Doctors had prescribed it to pregnant women to prevent miscarriages throughout the 40s and 50s, and by the early 70s their daughters were developing a rare form of vaginal cancer at alarming rates. The FDA banned DES as a feed additive in 1972 after Department of Agriculture inspectors detected residues in beef liver. The cattle industry challenged the ban in court and won, putting DES right back into the feed supply. 7 more years of legal battles followed before the FDA issued a final ban in 1979. For nearly 3 decades, families ate beef laced with a hormone under active investigation for causing cancer in humans. The ingredient list on a can of Mountain Dew once included something you could also find in flame retardants. Brominated vegetable oil was used since the 1920s to keep citrus flavoring from floating to the top of sodas. The compound contained bromine, a corrosive element that accumulates in human tissue. Studies tied chronic exposure to thyroid damage, memory loss, and reproductive harm. The EU banned BVO in 2008. Japan restricted it years earlier. The FDA flagged concerns in 1977, set temporary usage limits, and then let those limits stand for 47 years. PepsiCo quietly dropped BVO from Mountain Dew in 2020, but off-brand citrus sodas held on. The FDA did not formally ban it until July 2024. Every kitchen pantry in the 1970s held rows of canned goods sealed with a thin bead of lead tin alloy along the side seam. The process was cheap, reliable, and kept food stable for years. What nobody measured was what happened when acidic foods like tomatoes and citrus sat against that lead seam for months at a time. The acid drew the metal straight into the food. A 1982 study by the National Academy of Sciences determined that lead-soldered cans were responsible for up to half the total daily lead intake in some individuals. Kids absorbed lead at 4 to 5 times the rate adults did, and canned infant formula ranked among the worst offenders. The sharp, faintly metallic taste of certain canned fruits was not a flaw in the recipe, it was the lead. The industry called the amounts negligible. Federal regulations finally phased out lead solder in American food cans by the mid-1980s. By that point, entire generations had been eating contaminated food at every meal. Raw milk, unheated, unfiltered, straight from the cow, was the only milk Americans knew before pasteurization became common in the early 20th century. It carried tuberculosis, typhoid, diphtheria, and scarlet fever. Pasteur's heating process changed everything, and by the mid-1920s, most states required it by law. Still, raw milk never fully vanished. The FDA banned its interstate sale in 1987, and 21 states prohibit it outright today. The rest allow it under restrictions ranging from farm gate sales to limited retail. The CDC has reported that unpasteurized dairy is 840 times more likely to cause foodborne illness than pasteurized milk. Between 1993 and 2012, regulators traced 127 outbreaks to raw dairy, sickening nearly 2,000 people. A vocal consumer movement keeps pushing for broader access. The FDA has not moved. Fresh ackee is Jamaica's national fruit, a Caribbean breakfast staple, and completely illegal to bring into the United States in its unprocessed form. The FDA banned fresh ackee imports in 1973 because of hypoglycin A, a toxin concentrated in the unripe fruit. Consumed too early, it triggers Jamaican vomiting sickness, severe blood sugar drops that can lead to seizures, coma, and death. A ripe ackee is safe, but inspectors have no reliable way to check ripeness at the border. Canned ackee from approved processors remains legal, which is how Jamaican restaurants across the country still serve ackee and saltfish. Travelers who try to carry fresh pods through customs face seizure and steep fines. Over 50 years later, the ban shows no sign of lifting. If ackee was banned for what nature put inside it, ephedra was banned for what a corporation concealed. Metabolife 356 was the top-selling ephedra supplement in America during the late 90s, pushed as a weight loss breakthrough. The active compounds, ephedrine alkaloids, spiked heart rate and blood pressure while suppressing appetite. Metabolife International received over 14,000 adverse event reports from customers. Heart attacks, strokes, seizures, psychiatric episodes. The company disclosed none of them. When the Department of Justice compelled Metabolife to release its records in 2002, regulators found more than 15,000 buried complaints. Co-founder Michael Ellis was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison for hiding the data. The FDA collected over 18,000 total adverse reports before issuing a final ban in April 2004. NFL lineman Corey Stringer's heat-stroke death in 2001, with ephedra as a contributing factor, became the public face of the crisis. Procter & Gamble spent 25 years developing Olestra, a synthetic fat substitute the body could not absorb. The pitch was irresistible: chips with zero fat, zero cholesterol, zero guilt. The FDA approved it in 1996 under the brand name Olean, and fat-free Lay's arrived on shelves almost immediately. The backlash was just as fast. Consumers flooded the FDA with reports of severe cramping, diarrhea, and what the medical community politely termed anal leakage. Olestra also blocked absorption of vitamins A, D, E, and K, so every bag carried a mandated warning label. Canada and the EU banned it outright. American sales cratered. No U.S. product on the market contains Olestra today. It was never officially pulled, it just became impossible to sell. Four Loko arrived on college campuses in 2005 as a tall, brightly colored can that combined cheap malt liquor with a heavy dose of caffeine, taurine, and guarana. Students called it blackout in a can. One 23.5-ounce serving packed roughly the alcohol of 4 beers and the caffeine of 2 Red Bulls into a single container for under $3. The caffeine masked the sedative effects of the alcohol, so drinkers kept going long past the point where their bodies would normally shut down. In 2010, a string of hospitalizations hit the news. 9 students at Central Washington University were rushed to emergency rooms after a single party. States began banning the drink. Massachusetts moved first. The FDA issued warning letters to Fusion Projects and 3 other manufacturers, declaring caffeine an unsafe additive in alcoholic beverages. By November 2010, the original formula was pulled from shelves nationwide. Fusion Projects reformulated without stimulants, but the original recipe is still sold in several countries overseas. Red Dye No. 3 colored your conversation hearts, your maraschino cherries, your strawberry milk, and your cough syrup. The FDA first approved it in 1907, the same era when cigarettes were physician-recommended. By 1990, the agency had enough evidence from rat studies to ban it from cosmetics and topical drugs under the Delaney Clause, which prohibits any additive shown to cause cancer in animals. But the FDA left it legal in food. For 35 years, a dye banned from lipstick was permitted in candy marketed to kids. The FDA's own estimates showed that American preschoolers consumed twice as much Red Dye No. 3 per body weight as the general population. California forced the issue in 2023, becoming the first state to ban it in food products. The FDA finally followed in January 2025, giving manufacturers until 2027 to reformulate. It took over 3 decades of consumer advocacy, a state-level ban, and a color additive petition to close a loophole the agency itself had created. If Red Dye No. 3 tested the limits of what regulators would allow in American food, Casu Marzu obliterated them. This Sardinian cheese starts as a wheel of pecorino made from sheep's milk. The rind is cut open so cheese skipper flies can lay their eggs inside. When the larvae hatch, they burrow through the cheese, digesting the proteins and transforming the interior into a soft, pungent cream. The cheese is meant to be eaten with the maggots still alive and wriggling. Dead larvae mean it has spoiled. Diners in Sardinia traditionally cover the cheese with one hand while eating, because the maggots can leap up to 15 centimeters when disturbed. The Guinness Book of World Records named Casu Marzu the most dangerous cheese in the world in 2009. It is banned in the United States and was banned in the EU until Italian authorities successfully argued it was a protected traditional food. Smugglers still try to carry it through U.S. customs in luggage, risking seizure and fines. In Tokyo, a chef must train for 2 years and pass a rigorous certification exam before being allowed to prepare fugu. Roughly half of the candidates fail. The reason is tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin concentrated in the liver, ovaries, and skin of the pufferfish, potent enough that a single fish carries enough poison to kill 30 adults. There is no antidote. One wrong cut during preparation releases the toxin into the flesh. The FDA banned the importation of fugu in the early 1980s because no equivalent certification program existed in the United States, making the fish impossible to regulate safely. For decades, the ban held absolutely. Then Nippon, New York City's oldest traditional Japanese restaurant, lobbied for an exception and eventually secured a permit to import fugu from a single approved Japanese supplier under strict oversight. A handful of American restaurants now serve it legally, but the fish remains one of the most tightly controlled foods in the country. Scotland's national dish has been locked out of the United States since 1971, and the reason has nothing to do with taste. Traditional haggis is a savory pudding made from sheep's heart, liver, and lungs, mixed with oatmeal, onions, and spices, then cooked inside a sheep's stomach casing. The USDA's objection is specific. Livestock lungs shall not be saved for use as human food. That single regulation, still in effect today, makes authentic haggis illegal to import or sell anywhere in America. The Scottish government has lobbied repeatedly to get the ban overturned, arguing that haggis is safe, culturally significant, and consumed without incident across the United Kingdom and Europe. American regulators have not budged. Scottish-American communities have responded by producing lung-free haggis domestically, which purists consider an acceptable compromise at best. Every Burns night supper in America is technically serving a modified version of the dish it is meant to celebrate. For nearly a century, absinthe carried a reputation as a hallucinogenic poison that drove men to madness and murder. The spirit, distilled from wormwood and anise, was banned across Europe and in the United States beginning around 1912. The supposed villain was thujone, a compound in wormwood that critics claimed caused psychosis, seizures, and violent behavior. Absinthe became the scapegoat for everything wrong with turn-of-the-century drinking culture. The problem was that most of the claims were false. Modern chemical analysis has shown that historical absinthe contained far less thujone than anyone feared, and the real culprit behind the era's absinthe-fueled incidents was most likely just extremely high alcohol content, often exceeding 70%. In 2007, the FDA quietly lifted the ban, allowing absinthe to be sold in America provided it contains less than 10 parts per million of thujone. You can now buy it at most well-stocked liquor stores, though the century of mythology still clings to the bottle. In 2011, a company called HBB LLC started selling lazy cakes, chocolate brownies laced with 8 milligrams of melatonin per serving, more than the recommended adult dose of the sleep hormone. The packaging was playful, the price was low, and nothing on the wrapper warned parents that their kids were about to eat a sedative disguised as a snack. Reports of hospitalized kids reached the FDA almost immediately. The state of Arkansas moved to ban the product outright. The FDA issued a warning letter declaring that melatonin was not an approved food additive and could not legally be added to baked goods sold as food. HBB responded with a creative dodge. They reclassified the brownies as a dietary supplement, renamed them Lazy Larry, and kept selling. The product was never formally banned at the federal level. It was simply forced into a regulatory gray zone where a brownie full of sleep hormone could remain on shelves by calling itself something other than food. If lazy cakes slipped through a regulatory loophole, shark fin soup was dragged through years of legislative warfare before the law finally caught up. Shark finning, the practice of catching a shark, slicing off its fins, and dumping the still-living body back into the ocean, supplied a global market worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In America, the fins turned up in specialty restaurants in cities with large Chinese communities where a single bowl of soup could cost over $100. The ecological cost was staggering. Shark populations in the Atlantic declined by up to 88% over the past half-century, largely driven by the fin trade. State-level bans started appearing around 2010, with 12 states eventually prohibiting the sale of shark fins. The federal hammer dropped in December 2022 when the Shark Fin Sales Elimination Act was signed into law as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, making it illegal to possess, buy, or sell shark fins anywhere in the country. Foie gras is French for fatty liver, and the process behind it is exactly as uncomfortable as that translation suggests. Ducks and geese are force-fed grain and fat through a metal tube inserted down their throats, a practice called gavage, until their livers swell to several times their natural size. The birds often develop difficulty breathing, standing, and walking. Some tear out their own feathers from distress. The resulting liver is sold as a luxury delicacy, priced at $40 or more per pound in specialty markets. Chicago banned the sale of foie gras in 2006, then reversed the ban in 2008 under pressure from the restaurant industry. California implemented a more durable ban in 2012, which survived multiple legal challenges. New York City voted to ban it in 2019, effective 2022. A nationwide federal ban has never materialized, but the state-by-state momentum continues to build. Eating horse meat is not technically a federal crime in the United States. Selling it is another matter entirely. Congress effectively killed the American horse meat industry, not by passing an outright ban, but by defunding the USDA's ability to inspect horse slaughterhouses. Without federal inspection, horse meat cannot legally be sold, served, or distributed anywhere in America. The move was driven less by food safety concerns than by cultural revulsion. Americans view horses as companions, not livestock. Before the funding cut, the United States had been a significant exporter of horse meat to countries where it is commonly eaten, including France, Belgium, and Italy. Advocates for horse meat point out that it is leaner than beef, lower in cholesterol, and contains 4 times the iron. Environmental researchers note that horses produce far less methane than cattle. None of those arguments have swayed American legislators or consumers. The taboo holds, enforced not by science, but by sentiment and a budget line item. Beluga caviar was once the most expensive food sold in the United States, priced at roughly $200 an ounce at its peak. The salt-cured eggs of the beluga sturgeon, harvested primarily from the Caspian Sea, were a fixture of luxury dining and high-end cocktail parties. Demand outpaced what nature could sustain. Decades of overfishing pushed the beluga sturgeon toward extinction, and in 2005, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service banned the importation of wild beluga caviar along with all other beluga products. The international ban was partially eased by the United Nations in 2007, but the American prohibition remains in effect. The only legal source of beluga caviar in the country is Sturgeon Aqua Farms in Florida, the sole licensed domestic breeder of beluga sturgeon, which also donates fertilized eggs to help rebuild wild populations. The ortolan bunting is a songbird smaller than a sparrow, and the traditional French method of preparing it is one of the most disturbing rituals in culinary history. The birds were captured alive using nets, kept in dark boxes to disrupt their feeding cycles, and force-fed millet until they doubled in size. Then they were drowned in Armagnac brandy, roasted whole and eaten in a single bite, bones, organs, and all, with a cloth napkin draped over the diner's head. The napkin, according to tradition, was meant to trap the aromas. Others said it was to hide the act from God. Poaching drove an 88% decline in the ortolan population across Europe. France banned the sale and hunting of the bird in 1999, and the United States prohibits its import under migratory bird protections. The dish still appears occasionally on black market menus in France, but in America it remains firmly illegal. What happened to the ortolan over centuries? A single chef managed to do to the redfish in under a decade. In 1980, New Orleans chef Paul Prudhomme published his recipe for blackened redfish, and the dish became an overnight sensation. Restaurants from the Gulf Coast to Manhattan could not keep it on the menu. Recreational anglers descended on Louisiana waters in numbers the ecosystem had never seen. Within 6 years, the redfish population had collapsed. In 1986, the Commerce Department forced Gulf fisheries to close and imposed strict catch limits to keep the species from disappearing entirely. Today, it is illegal to sell redfish commercially in every U.S. state except Mississippi. Recreational fishing is still allowed under tight regulations, but the days of ordering it in a restaurant are over in 49 states. One recipe turned a common saltwater fish into an endangered species. Chilean sea bass is not actually a bass. It is the Patagonian toothfish, rebranded in 1977 by a fish merchant named Lee Lance because he figured nobody would order something called a toothfish. The marketing worked too well. By the 1990s, Chilean sea bass had become one of the most sought-after fish in upscale American restaurants, and illegal fishing operations in the Southern Ocean were hauling in thousands of tons each year. Pirate vessels flying flags of convenience stripped the fishery faster than it could recover. The U.S. responded by restricting sales to only certified fishing vessels and capping the number of fish each could catch. 24 other nations imposed similar controls. The fish is not fully banned, but the regulatory framework around it is so tight that every fillet sold in America must be traceable back to a specific licensed boat. Queen conch were once so abundant in the Caribbean that their shells piled up in mounds along the shoreline. The meat was cheap, plentiful, and central to island cooking: fritters, salads, chowders. American tourists brought the taste home, and demand surged through the 1960s and 70s. By the early 80s, the conch population in Florida waters had effectively collapsed. The state banned commercial harvesting of queen conch entirely. The federal government followed with an import ban that remains in force today. In the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos, populations have also declined sharply despite local protections. Marine biologists warn that queen conch reproduce slowly, reaching sexual maturity only after 3 to 4 years, which makes recovery painfully gradual even under strict management. The conch fritter you can still order at some Florida restaurants is made from imported, farm-raised, or legally sourced Caribbean conch, never wild Florida stock. In 1911, the federal government banned the cultivation and interstate transport of black currants across the entire United States. The reason had nothing to do with human health. Black currant bushes carry a fungus called white pine blister rust, which is harmless to the currants but lethal to white pine trees. The American timber industry, worth billions even then, lobbied hard, and the ban stuck for most of the 20th century. Federal restrictions were eased in 1966, but individual states kept their own prohibitions for decades. New York did not lift its ban until 2003. Growers in the Northeast have since revived the tart, vitamin-rich berry, but many Western states still restrict large-scale planting to protect their timber stands. For nearly a century, an entire fruit vanished from American grocery shelves, farmers' markets, and recipes, not because it was dangerous to eat, but because it threatened a tree. Sea turtle soup was once a dish served at presidential banquets. William Howard Taft, who held office from 1909 to 1913, loved it so much that he employed a personal chef dedicated solely to preparing it. Campbell's sold a canned version to meet public demand. The soup was a staple of fine dining well into the mid-20th century, made from green sea turtles harvested off the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. Unregulated hunting drove turtle populations to the edge of extinction. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 made it illegal to hunt, capture, import, or sell sea turtles for any purpose, including food. The ban was absolute. No exceptions for tradition, no grandfather clauses for existing inventory. The canned version vanished from store shelves. Mock turtle soup made from calf's head became the substitute. Today, sea turtles are revered as conservation symbols. A century earlier, they were dinner. In 1970, California Governor Ronald Reagan signed a law banning the sale of kangaroo meat and kangaroo leather products in the state, effective 1973. The legislation was driven by animal welfare advocates who argued that commercial kangaroo culling in Australia was brutal and unsustainable, with millions of animals killed each year for export. California's ban made it illegal to buy, sell, or import kangaroo products within state lines. Other states considered similar measures, though none matched California's scope. Australia pushed back repeatedly, insisting that its culling programs were scientifically managed and ecologically necessary. The kangaroo population, they argued, was not endangered. It numbered in the tens of millions. California legislators were unmoved. The ban has been challenged in court multiple times and temporarily suspended, but as of today, it remains on the books. In one of the largest agricultural states in America, you cannot legally purchase a kangaroo steak. Aerosol cheese in steel cans was the kind of futuristic food that only the 1950s could have dreamed up. It was creamy, convenient, and somehow scientific. All the things that modern America was obsessed with at the time. Housewives marveled at how it could be sprayed directly onto crackers, celery sticks, or even straight into the mouth of a giggling child. It felt like progress you could taste. No knife, no cleanup, no effort. The secret behind the spray was pressure from chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, the same chemicals used in aerosol hairspray and refrigeration. They made the cheese foam perfectly, airy and light, and gave it that signature hiss when you pressed the nozzle. Nobody thought twice about it until scientists in the 1970s revealed that CFCs were eating away at the ozone layer, literally tearing a hole in the atmosphere. What had once been the pride of kitchen technology suddenly became an environmental villain. The cheese itself wasn't the problem. It was what made it spray that turned it into a global issue. Companies scrambled to replace the formula, switching to safer propellants, but the reputation stuck. The phrase "cheese in a can" went from novelty to punchline. For those who lived through its rise, it will always taste like nostalgia and a little bit of guilt. High nitrite processed meats were lunchbox favorites throughout the 1980s, filling sandwiches and sizzling on breakfast plates without anyone worrying about what kept them so pink. Hot dogs, bacon, deli ham, and bologna relied on sodium nitrite to maintain color, extend shelf life, and prevent dangerous bacteria. Parents packed these meats into school lunches, believing they provided protein and convenience in one neat package. Families consumed them at barbecues, ball games, and weeknight dinners without hesitation. But nitrites can transform into nitrosamines during cooking or digestion, and researchers linked these compounds to increased cancer risks in the digestive system. The more processed meat people ate, the higher their exposure became, and children who grew up on daily servings absorbed more than anyone realized. Regulators eventually stepped in with strict limits on how much nitrite manufacturers could add, forcing companies to reformulate recipes. The hot dogs and bacon of today contain far less preservative than their 80s counterparts, but the memory of those heavily preserved meats lingers as a warning about trusting convenience too completely. Push lawnmowers in the 1960s were basic, brutal, and built without modern safety features, especially blade guards. You'd give it a shove and pray that nothing too solid was in its path. Rocks, twigs, hidden toys. Too bad. That exposed blade would launch them with the precision and speed of a slingshot. Kids watched from porches, ducking when they saw sparks fly. No engine meant it was all about torque. Pure metal teeth rotating just inches from your ankles. And the blade was always visible, waiting, spinning like something out of a horror movie. Wear long pants? Not a chance. It was the 60s. You were probably mowing in shorts and sneakers with socks rolled halfway down. If you slipped, tripped, or tilted the mower even slightly, There was no buffer, no guard, just steel teeth and physics. It taught you to walk a straight line. Accidents happened more than anyone likes to admit, and all for a yard that would be ankle-high again in 3 days. But if lawn duty wasn't enough danger for one Saturday, just wait until you remember those heavy handheld massagers buzzing on every coffee table. Yep, you heard that right. In the 1970s, you could go to the store and buy a science kit that came with actual radioactive samples. Glowing rocks, uranium ore, the whole radioactive shebang. These kits were sold as educational tools, a way to spark curiosity in young minds. And they did, right before they sparked some very serious health concerns. Back then, no one batted an eye. Parents figured if it came in a box with a smiling cartoon scientist on the front, it had to be safe. Kids were in their rooms waving Geiger counters around like they were playing laser tag, all while absorbing trace amounts of nuclear material. It was science. It was cool. It was totally wild. Of course, by the time the risks caught up to the curiosity, these kits had already found their way into thousands of households. That glow-in-the-dark magic? Yeah, turns out it was not so magical after all. But if you thought glowing uranium in your closet was risky, wait until you hear what people kept in their trucks, in full view, completely unlocked, and nobody cared. Potassium bromate bread was a bakery staple throughout the 1980s, helping commercial loaves rise higher, hold their shape, and develop that soft texture shoppers expected from store-bought bread. Bakers added this dough conditioner because it strengthened gluten and improved results in ways that made industrial baking faster and more profitable. Families bought these loaves for sandwiches, toast, and dinner rolls without noticing the ingredient buried in packaging labels. The bread looked normal, tasted normal, and seemed like what everyone had always eaten. But potassium bromate was eventually classified as a possible human carcinogen after studies linked it to kidney tumors and thyroid damage. Countries around the world began banning it from food production, removing it from bakeries across Europe, Canada, and Asia. The United States moved more slowly, leaving decisions to individual states and allowing some manufacturers to continue using it. Today, shoppers who check labels can still find bromate in some products, a lingering reminder that not every country responded to the same science with the same urgency, and that loaves from decades past carried risks bakers never disclosed. Lard-based frosting sold in tins were the unsung stars of post-war baking aisles. Housewives praised them as miracles, ready to spread, shelf-stable, and guaranteed to make cakes look beautiful for days. They were smooth, sweet, and rich with a comforting aroma. For families still recovering from the war, they symbolized abundance, an indulgence that could turn a plain cake into something special. Advertisers sold them with smiling mothers and birthday candles, proof that convenience was the new luxury. Few realized those glossy cakes were hiding spoonfuls of industrial fat processed beyond recognition. But beneath that charm was a mess of unregulated animal fats, processed with unknown chemicals to extend shelf life. Over time, these frostings were found to be dangerously high in cholesterol and trans fats, contributing to heart disease. The same product that crowned birthday cakes with joy was silently clogging arteries across the nation. Once nutritionists connected the dots, those tins vanished from grocery shelves almost overnight. Still, for those who grew up in the 1950s, that sweet, greasy taste brings back the smell of birthdays and bake sales. It was the flavor of a time when no one read ingredient lists and when indulgence came before information. Cap guns with realistic shell ejection were supposed to bring the Old West to your backyard. Instead, they brought cops to your front door. These toys didn't just look real, they felt it, sounded it, and even mimicked the weight and mechanics of an actual revolver. Some had removable clips. Others featured spring-loaded cartridges that popped out with satisfying force after each imaginary shot. But as law enforcement dealt with rising gun violence, these hyper-realistic toys became a serious safety issue. Officers couldn't tell from a distance, or even up close, whether a kid was holding a toy or a real weapon. Tragic mistakes happened. Parents panicked. Regulations followed, mandating bright colors and orange tips on toy guns. But for a time, kids walked around neighborhoods wielding what looked like legitimate firearms, pretending to be cowboys, spies, or action heroes. The shell ejection feature made it even more dramatic, spent rounds flying out as you pulled the trigger again and again. It was cinematic, it was dangerous, and eventually it was banned. Of course, if the cap gun didn't get you, mowing the lawn with a spinning death blade just might have. Chemistry sets in the 1960s were less about learning formulas and more about dodging danger with every experiment. These kits came with powders, acids, glass tubes, and, wait for it, alcohol burners. Real ones. You'd light a flame with a match, pour flammable liquids into little dishes, and watch as something fizzed, foamed, or went up in smoke. It was thrilling, chaotic, and completely normal. Instructions were vague at best and safety gear optional at most. Kids could melt plastic, set fire to paper, or accidentally discover the smell of burnt eyebrows. These were sold as educational tools, but really they were training grounds for pyromaniacs. You'd mix mystery powders just to see what color they turned, or if they'd explode. Parents watched from a distance, maybe keeping a glass of water nearby just in case. The burners themselves were tiny metal cups with open flames that danced like tiny bonfires across your kitchen table. One wrong move and suddenly your science project doubled as a fire drill. And if you didn't lose an eyebrow there, you might lose an eye to the next toy on the list, because clackers weren't just noisy, they were downright dangerous. Des treated beef-filled meat counters throughout the 1980s, coming from cattle that had been injected with diethylstilbestrol to make them grow faster and produce more meat per animal. Ranchers loved the hormone because it meant bigger profits in less time, and grocery stores sold the beef without any labels warning customers what had been pumped into the animals they were eating. Families grilled steaks, roasted roasts, and fried hamburgers completely unaware that a synthetic estrogen was woven into every bite. The meat looked normal, tasted normal, and cost less than it might have otherwise, which made everyone happy until the truth surfaced. DES had already been linked to serious health problems in humans, including rare cancers in the daughters of women who had taken it during pregnancy. When researchers began questioning whether residues in beef posed similar risks, regulators moved quickly to ban the hormone from livestock production. The beef industry scrambled to adjust, and families who had trusted their local butcher suddenly wondered what else might be hiding in the meat they served for dinner every night. Olestra fat-free snack foods were supposed to change the world, or at least the waistlines of America. When they hit the shelves in the 1990s, people could not believe it. Potato chips with all the flavor and none of the fat. Ads promised guilt-free indulgence, a revolution in snacking. The secret was Olestra, a synthetic fat molecule that passed through the body undigested. The science seemed sound, the dream flawless, until people started eating it. Within months, complaints poured in. The chips tasted fine, but they came with a terrible side effect: sudden, uncontrollable digestive distress. The phrase anal leakage became an unintentional part of pop culture. Consumers were horrified, and late-night comedians had a field day. Regulators eventually forced warning labels on Olestra products, and the once promising miracle faded into embarrassment. For a while, the brand tried to rebrand and reformulate, but the damage was done. People no longer trusted any food that claimed to cheat nature. The shelves emptied, and the name Olestra joined the long list of scientific missteps dressed up as progress. It was the perfect lesson of the modern food age. You can outsmart fat, but not the body. Gasoline-scented model airplane glue was the secret sauce of childhood creativity and accidental intoxication. The solvent-heavy adhesive smelled like a gas station in July, sharp enough to make your nose sting and your eyes water. Kids would crack open the tube, squeeze out a glob, and before you could say ventilation, they'd be glassy-eyed and dizzy. This wasn't your average school glue. It was packed with toluene and other solvents that evaporated quickly, creating fumes that went straight to the brain. And back then, no one batted an eye. Parents assumed the lightheadedness was from excitement. In reality, kids were unintentionally getting high. Some took it further and started sniffing glue on purpose, leading to a whole wave of accidental addiction. It became a national concern. Stores put warning labels on the tubes. Glue brands changed formulas, but the damage was already done. For a brief moment, model kits were less about airplanes and more about buzzing in the back of your brain. That sharp chemical tang became the background scent of many basements, garages, and bedrooms. It stuck to your fingers, your clothes, and your memory. And the toys? Well, they often stayed unfinished because the builder was too loopy to finish gluing on the wings. But if model glue seemed risky, just wait until you see the next toy that looked exactly like a real weapon, down to the shell ejection. Lead-soldered canned goods sat in pantries across the country throughout the 1980s, holding everything from vegetables and soups to fruits and baby formula. The seams holding these cans together were sealed with lead solder, standard practice for decades because lead was cheap and created airtight seals. Families stacked these cans in cupboards, trusting that the contents were safe because canned food was supposed to last without spoiling. But lead does not stay locked in metal. It slowly leaches into food inside, especially when contents are acidic like tomatoes or citrus juices. Children were particularly vulnerable because their bodies absorbed lead more easily, and even small amounts could affect brain development and learning. Researchers began connecting childhood lead exposure to canned foods, and the findings were alarming enough to force regulatory action. The ban on lead solder in food cans came swiftly once evidence became undeniable, but millions of families had already consumed decades' worth of contaminated meals without ever knowing. Those old cans became symbols of an era when convenience sometimes came with invisible costs no one expected. Saccharin-sweetened soft drinks were the original promise of guilt-free pleasure. The 1950s called them miracle sodas, offering sweetness without sugar, calories, or consequence. Housewives stocked their fridges with shiny cans of Diet Cola, proud to serve something modern and figure-friendly. It seemed like a revolution, proof that science could outsmart nature. But by the late 1960s, lab tests told a different story. Rats given high doses of saccharin developed bladder cancer, and public trust shattered overnight. The reaction was immediate. Panicked consumers poured out bottles, and news anchors warned of poison in your pop. It became the first true food scare of the modern age, and every can of soda turned into a question of faith. People learned that even sweetness, when manufactured, could carry a sting. Though later research softened the panic, the damage was done. The first wave of diet drinks disappeared, leaving behind fear and confusion. People realized that artificial could mean dangerous, and zero-calorie might come with a hidden cost. Saccharin eventually returned under tight regulation, but it never regained the innocent glow it once had. What began as liberation through chemistry ended as a cautionary tale of too much faith in innovation. Home hair dryers in the 1960s looked like they came straight from a beauty salon, but without any of the safety checks. These early models had bulky hoods or handheld nozzles, often with thick cords that frayed faster than a worn shoelace. You'd plug them into the wall, perch near the bathroom sink, and hope for the best. No ground wires, no insulation. Just you, your wet hair, and a live current a sneeze away from disaster. The metal casing got hot. The motors sparked occasionally. And heaven help you if your fingers were damp. Water plus faulty wiring? That hairdo could turn into a fireworks show. Yet people trusted them because that sleek salon look felt worth the risk. Back then, it was just another day in the name of glamour. But if electricity was playing with fire, what we put directly on wounds wasn't much better, especially when it came in a bright red bottle with a mercury surprise. Brominated vegetable oil was quietly mixed into citrus-flavored sodas throughout the 1980s, keeping fruity flavoring evenly distributed instead of floating to the top. Families cracked open cans of orange, lemon lime, and grapefruit sodas without any idea that the same chemical used in flame retardants was swirling in their drinks. The ingredient worked so well that beverage companies relied on it for decades, adding it to sports drinks and fruit punches marketed to children and athletes. People consumed it at picnics, birthday parties, and everyday meals, never questioning why their drink stayed so perfectly blended. but bromine accumulates in the body over time, and researchers eventually linked it to thyroid problems and neurological issues that built up silently with every sip. When regulators announced a ban on brominated vegetable oil, the news shocked consumers who had never heard of the ingredient despite drinking it for years. Companies scrambled to reformulate recipes, and shoppers wondered what else might be hiding in the products they trusted without question. It became one more reminder that familiar labels can conceal unfamiliar dangers. In the 1950s, DDT was a household name for all the wrong reasons. Farmers, grocers, and even homemakers believed it was a miracle, a chemical that could protect crops from pests and keep fruits looking fresh for weeks. Produce was sprayed, dusted, and even rinsed in it before hitting grocery shelves. Apples gleamed brighter, tomatoes stayed red longer, and no one questioned it. You could not see the danger, and that made it easy to ignore. Decades later, scientists discovered that DDT was more than just a pesticide. It was a poison that lingered in soil, water, and even human tissue. It killed insects, yes, but it also harmed birds, fish, and people. The chemical built up in the environment until its effects could not be denied. The once fresh produce of the 1950s became a warning from history. What we cannot see can still hurt us. When DDT was banned, it marked a turning point in how America thought about safety, trust, and the true cost of convenience. Red dye. Number 3 candies glowed with that unmistakable cherry brightness throughout the 1980s, coloring everything from maraschino cherries to fruit snacks to holiday candies children devoured by the handful. The dye made foods look more appealing and festive, which meant manufacturers added it to anything they wanted to sell to kids. Parents bought these treats without concern because artificial colors seemed harmless compared to the sugars everyone worried about instead. Halloween bags, Easter baskets, and birthday favors overflowed with red-dyed candies that stained tongues and fingers bright crimson. But studies eventually linked red dye number 3 to thyroid tumors in laboratory animals, and the findings triggered regulatory action. The dye was banned from cosmetics and drugs, though it remained technically legal in some foods under complicated rules that confused consumers. The restrictions created a strange situation where the same dye could color candy, but not lipstick, raising questions about consistency and safety. Those bright red treats became symbols of an era when appearance mattered more than ingredients, and children consumed the consequences. Asbestos, oven mitts, and hot pads were marketed as indestructible. Advertisements promised they could handle any heat without ever catching fire. Housewives trusted them, pulling casseroles and roasts straight from the oven with confidence. It was the post-war era of atomic age optimism, when scientific materials meant progress and danger felt impossible. The word asbestos was said with pride. It sounded technical, modern, and safe. Nobody imagined that the same mineral used in insulation and factories could turn a kitchen into a slow-motion health hazard. The secret was asbestos, a mineral that could resist flames but released deadly fibers every time it was touched. Each squeeze, each fold, released invisible dust into the air. Over time, those fibers lodged deep in the lungs, leading to mesothelioma and other fatal illnesses decades later. The danger was silent and patient, hiding behind the promise of safety. By the time the truth came out, many who used them daily were already sick. Asbestos was once hailed as the perfect material for modern living. It ended up becoming one of history's most infamous killers. Those oven mitts, sold with warmth and trust, literally took people's breath away. Chlorofluorocarbon cooking sprays were kitchen staples throughout the 1980s, making it easy to coat pans and grease baking sheets with just a quick press of a nozzle. These aerosol cans sat beside stoves in nearly every home, used daily for frying eggs and preparing roasts. The spray came out in a fine mist that felt almost magical compared to pouring oil or spreading butter by hand. Families loved the convenience, and nobody thought twice about what propelled that mist out so effortlessly. But chlorofluorocarbons, the gases that made aerosol sprays work, were silently drifting upward and destroying the ozone layer that protects the planet from harmful radiation. Scientists discovered the damage and raised alarms that eventually reached policymakers worldwide. The ban on chlorofluorocarbons came as part of international agreements to protect the atmosphere, and cooking sprays were forced to switch to different propellants. Shoppers barely noticed the change in their kitchens, but the shift marked one of the first times a common grocery product was pulled for environmental reasons rather than direct health concerns, a reminder that what we spray indoors can affect the entire world. The E to Z bake oven of the 1960s was every kid's dream and every parent's insurance nightmare. The concept was genius. Let kids bake their own tiny cakes and cookies using a miniature oven powered by a real heating element. But instead of a light bulb like later versions, early models had exposed metal interior coils that heated up faster than your mom's stovetop. You'd slide your pan in, wait with giddy anticipation, and then reach in too soon, and bam, third-degree burn. The slot was small, but your fingers were smaller, and the outer casing didn't always stay cool. Many children learned their first painful lesson in thermal conductivity thanks to this pastel-colored appliance. The promise of baking independence quickly turned into a bandaged hand and a lecture about not touching hot things. Still, it was a hit. Birthday parties, sleepovers, weekend boredom, they all included E to Z bake sessions that hovered on the edge of emergency. Parents began supervising more closely, and eventually, newer models arrived with safer heat sources. But those early versions? They baked the cake and the kid, and if that burn healed up fast, your next real health threat was hanging right in front of your face every time you took a shower. Prepackaged luncheon meats were a post-war convenience that fit neatly into America's new rhythm. Busy days, quick lunches, no waste. Sliced, sealed, and ready to eat, these meats were the modern worker's dream. They filled sandwiches, lunchboxes, and picnic baskets across the nation. What no one realized was that heating them could trigger a dangerous reaction. The nitrates used to preserve their bright pink color produced nitrosamines, chemical compounds linked to cancer. Commercials showed happy families eating these sandwiches in spotless kitchens, while factories quietly churned out meats laced with preservatives no one could pronounce. It was the dawn of the convenience age, when speed and shelf life mattered more than nutrition. And like so many mid-century innovations, it took years before anyone asked what we were actually putting in our bodies. For years, people fried or broiled their sandwiches, unknowingly creating toxins right on their stovetops. Once scientists uncovered the truth, the industry was forced to reformulate, and entire brands vanished overnight. Luncheon meat never quite recovered its innocence. What was once a symbol of post-war efficiency became a reminder that convenience can carry a hidden cost. Unpasteurized raw milk was still available in many grocery stores during the 1980s, sitting in refrigerated sections alongside pasteurized cartons. Some shoppers specifically sought it out, believing it was healthier, more natural, and closer to what their grandparents drank straight from the farm. The creamy texture, richer taste, and idea that nothing had been processed made raw milk feel wholesome in a way modern dairy did not. Parents poured it over cereal, blended it into smoothies, and gave it to children who had no idea they were drinking something potentially dangerous. But unpasteurized milk can carry bacteria, including Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria, pathogens that pasteurization was specifically designed to kill. Outbreaks traced back to raw milk sickened families across the country, and some cases turned severe or even fatal. Regulators responded by tightening restrictions until raw milk became illegal in most grocery stores nationwide. Today, finding it requires visiting farms directly or navigating complex state laws, a far cry from when it sat casually on refrigerator shelves waiting for anyone to take it home. Mercury-tipped thermometers for cooking were once the gold standard of precision. Every 1950s kitchen had one. The sleek silver line inside was mesmerizing. It measured everything from candy to roast temperatures, ensuring no recipe failed. Parents marveled at the metallic shine, and kids watched the silver bead race up the tube as if it were alive. No one realized that inside that innocent glimmer was one of the most poisonous substances known to man. In homes across America, small spills turned into invisible clouds of vapor that lingered for hours, even days. But few knew that inside that little glass tube was one of the most toxic substances on Earth. Mercury, if released, could evaporate and poison the air, damaging nerves and organs. Accidents happened more often than you might think. One slip, one crack, and the shiny silver would roll across the counter like liquid metal, fascinating but deadly. Children played with it, adults brushed it off, and homes unknowingly filled with toxic vapor. Eventually, scientists proved what had long been suspected. Even tiny amounts could cause serious harm. The thermometer was replaced by safer tools, but its legacy lingered in the memories of those who grew up watching that silver line dance up and down with the heat. Every item on this list was sold, served, or eaten without a second thought. If this changed how you see your food, subscribe and share.